Pan Tadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz. Every subscription brings me enormous joy and motivation. Chapter 9. The Battle Argument, of the dangers arising from the disorderly conduct of a camp, unexpected succor, the gloomy situation of the gentry. The visit of the Bernardine, collecting alms, is an omen of rescue. Major Plute, by excessive gallantry, draws down a storm upon himself. A pistol shot, the signal for combat. The deeds of Sprinkler. The deeds and dangers of Masiek. Bucket by an ambuscade preserves Soplicowo. Reinforcements of cavalry. Attack on the infantry. The deeds of Thaddeus. Duel of the leaders interrupted by treason. The Seneschal, by a decisive maneuver, inclines the scales of combat. Bloody deeds of Gerwazi. The Chamberlain as a magnanimous victor. And they snored in so sound a sleep that they were not wakened by the gleam of lanterns and the entry of some dozens of men, who fell upon the gentry as wall spiders, called mowers, upon drowsy flies. Scarcely does one of them have time to buzz before the grim master encircles it around with long legs and strangles it. The sleep of the gentry was still sounder than the sleep of flies. Not a one buzzed. All lay as if lifeless, though they were seized by strong arms and thrown about like straw when it is bound into sheaves. Bucket alone, whose head was strongest at a banquet of all those in the district. Bucket, who could drink 2 butts of mead before his tongue faltered and his legs tottered. Bucket, though long had he feasted and deeply did he slumber, still gave a sign of life. He blinked with one eye and saw real nightmares. 2 dreadful faces directly above him, and each had a pair of mustaches. They breathed upon him and touched his lips with their mustaches and flourished about 4 hands like wings. He was terrified and wanted to cross himself, but he tried in vain to stir his arm. His right arm seemed pinned to his side. He strove to move his left. Alas, he found that the spirits had wrapped him tight as a babe in swaddling bands. He was terrified still more frightfully. Immediately he closed his eyes and lay without breathing. He grew cold and was near to death. But Sprinkler made an effort to defend himself, too late, for he was already bound fast in his own belt. However, he twisted himself about and leapt up with such a spring that he fell back on the breasts of the sleeping men and rolled over their heads. He tossed like a pike when it writhes on the sand, and roared like a bear, for he had strong lungs. He roared, "Treachery!" At once the whole company awoke and answered in chorus, "Treachery! Violence! Treachery!" The cry went echoing to the mirror room where slept the Count, Gerwazi, and the jockeys. Gerwazi awoke, and in vain struggled to free himself, for he was tied fast at full length to his own sword. He looked about and saw by the window armed men in short black helmets and green uniforms. One of them, girt with a scarf, held a sword, and with its point directed his company of men, whispering, "Bind, bind!" Around him lay the jockeys, tied up like sheep. The Count was sitting unbound but without arms, and by him stood 2 private soldiers with bare bayonets. Gerwazi recognized them. Alas, the Muscovites! Often had the warden been in like distress, often had he felt ropes on his arms and legs, and yet he had freed himself, for he knew a way of breaking bands. He was very strong and trusted in himself. He planned to save himself by silence. He closed his eyes as if he were asleep, slowly stretched out his arms and legs, held his breath, and contracted his belly and his chest to the utmost. Then suddenly he grew short, puffed himself out, and doubled up. As a serpent, when it hides its head and tail in its coils, so Gerwazi became short and thick instead of long. The cords stretched and even creaked, but did not break. From very shame and terror the warden turned over and hid his angry face upon the floor. Closing his eyes, he lay senseless as a log. Then the drums began to roll, at first slowly, then with a rumble that became ever faster and louder. At this signal, the Muscovite officer gave orders to lock up the Count and the jockeys in the hall, under guard, but to take the gentry out into the yard, where the other company was stationed. In vain Sprinkler fumed and struggled. The staff was stationed in the yard, and with it many armed gentry, the Podhaskis, Burbashas, Hrechekas, Birgulls, all friends or kinsmen of the judge. They had hastened to his relief when they heard of the attack upon him, the more eagerly since they had long been at odds with the Dobrinskis. Who had summoned the battalion of Muscovites from the villages? Who had gathered so quickly the neighbors from the hamlets? Was it the assessor or Jankiel? As to this, there were various rumors, but no one knew with certainty either then or later. Already the sun was rising and showed blood red. Its blunt edge, as if stripped of beams, was half visible and half hidden in the black clouds, like a heated horseshoe in the charcoal of a forge. The wind was rising, and it drove on the clouds from the east, crowded and jagged as blocks of ice. Each cloud, as it passed over, sprinkled cold rain. Behind it rushed the wind and dried the rain again. After the wind again, a damp cloud flew by, and thus the day by turns was cold and drizzly. Meanwhile, the major had given orders to drag up the beams that were drying near the yard, and in each beam to cut with an axe semicircular notches. Into these notches he thrust the legs of the prisoners and closed them with another beam. The two logs, nailed together at the ends, fastened upon the legs like the jaws of a bulldog. With cords they tied the arms of the gentry still more tightly behind their backs. The major, for their further torment, had already had their caps pulled from their heads, and from their backs their cloaks, their contuches, and even their jackets, even their tunics. Thus the gentry, fastened in the stocks, sat in a row, chattering their teeth in the cold and the rain, for the drizzle kept increasing. In vain Sprinkler fumed and struggled. Vainly the judge interceded for the gentry, and vainly Telemina joined her entreaties to the tears of Zosia, that they should have more regard for the captives. Captain Nikita Rykov, to be sure, a Muscovite but a good fellow, allowed himself to be mollified, but this was of no avail, since he himself had to obey Major Plut. This major, by birth a Pole from the little town of Jerowice, according to report, had been named Plutowicz in Polish, but had changed his name. He was a great rascal, as is usually the case with Poles that turn Muscovites in the Tsar's service. Plut, with his pipe in his mouth and his hands on his hips, stood in front of the ranks of soldiers. When people bowed to him, he turned up his nose, and in answer, as a sign of his wrathful humor, he puffed out a cloud of smoke and walked towards the house. But meanwhile, the judge had been appeasing Rykov, and likewise taking aside the assessor. They were consulting how to end the affair out of court, and, what was still more important, without interference from the government. So Captain Rykov said to Major Plut, "Major, what do we want of all these captives? If we send them up for trial, there will be great trouble for the gentry of the district, and no one will give you any reward for it, sir. I tell you, Major, it will be better to settle the matter quietly. The judge will have to reward you for your pains, and we will say that we came here on a visit. Thus the goats will be whole, and the wolf will be full. There is a Russian proverb, 'All can be done with caution,' and another proverb, 'Roast your own meat on the Tsar's spit,' and a third proverb, 'Harmony is better than discord.' Tie the knot tight and put the ends in the water. We will not make a report, so that nobody will find out. God gave hands to take with, that is a Russian proverb." When he heard this, the major rose and exploded with wrath. "Are you mad, Rykov? This is the imperial service, and service is not friendship, you idiotic old Rykov. Are you mad? Shall I discharge rebels in these warlike times? Ha, my Polish friends, I'll teach you rebellion. Ha, you rascally Dobzhinsky gentlemen. Oh, I know you. Let the rascals soak." And he guffawed as he looked out of the window. "Why, that same Dobzhinsky who is sitting with his coat on. Hey, take off his coat. Last year at the masked ball started that squabble with me." "Who began it?" "He, not I. I was dancing, and he yelled, 'Turn the scoundrel out!' Since I was just then under investigation for stealing from the regimental treasury, I was much embarrassed. But what business was it of his? I was dancing the mazurka, and he shouted from behind, 'Scoundrel!' The gentry after him cried, 'Hurrah!' They insulted me. Well, the beggarly gentleman has fallen into my claws. I said to him, 'See here, Dobzhinsky, the goat will come to the butcher's wagon.' Well, Dobzhinsky, switches are cut for you, you see." Then he bent over and whispered into the judge's ear, "Judge, if you want to have this matter hushed up, 1,000 rubles cash for each head. 1,000 rubles, Judge, that's my last word." The judge tried to bargain, but the major would not listen. Once more he stalked about the room and puffed out clouds of smoke, like a squib or a rocket. The women followed him, imploring and weeping. "Major," said the judge, "even if you go to law, what will you gain? There has been no bloody battle here, and no wounds. For their eating of hens and geese they will pay fines according to the statute. I shall not make complaint against the Count. This was only an ordinary squabble between neighbors. Judge, said the major, have you read the yellow book? What yellow book? Asked the judge. A book, said the major, that is better than all your statutes, and in it every other word is halter, Siberia, the knout, the book of martial law, now proclaimed throughout all Lithuania. Your tribunals are now on the shelf. According to martial law, for such pranks you will at the very least be sent to hard labor in Siberia. I appeal to the governor, said the judge. Appeal to the emperor if you want to, said Plut. You know that when the emperor confirms decrees, he often by his grace doubles the penalty. Appeal, and perhaps in case of need, my dear judge, I shall get a good hold on you too. Jankiel, a spy whom the government has long been tracking, is a frequenter of your house and the tenant of your tavern. I may now put every one of you under arrest at once. Arrest me, said the judge. How do you dare without orders? And the dispute was becoming more and more lively when a new guest rode into the farmyard. A strange throng was coming in. In front, like a courier, ran an immense black ram whose brow bristled with 4 horns, 2 of which were decked with bells and curled about his ears, and 2 jutted out sidewise from his forehead and were hung with small, round, tinkling brass balls. After the ram came oxen and a flock of sheep and goats. Behind the cattle were 4 heavily loaded wagons. All divined that Father Roback, the alms-gatherer, had arrived. So the judge, knowing his duty as host, took his stand on the threshold to welcome the guest. The monk rode on the first wain, his face half hidden by his cowl, but they immediately recognized him, for when he passed the prisoners, he turned his countenance towards them and made a sign to them with his finger. And the driver of the second wain was equally well known, old Mickiewicz, the switch, disguised as a peasant. The gentry began to shout as soon as he appeared. He said only idiots and imposed silence by a gesture. On the third wagon was the Prussian in a torn overcoat, and Zan and Mickiewicz rode on the fourth. Meanwhile, the Podhaiskis and the Isajewiczes, the Burbashes, Wilbiks, Birgels, and Kotviches, seeing the Dobrzynskis under so severe constraint, began slowly to cool down from their former wrath. For the Polish gentry, though beyond measure quarrelsome and eager for fighting, are nevertheless not vindictive. So they ran to old Maciej for counsel. He stationed the whole crowd about the wagons and told them to wait. The Bernardine entered the room. They hardly recognized him, though he had not changed his clothes. His bearing was so different. He was ordinarily gloomy and thoughtful, but now he held his head high, and with a radiant mien, like a jolly monk, he laughed long before he began to talk. "Ha! Ha! My respects, my respects! Ha! Ha! Excellent, first class. Officers, some people hunt by day, but you by night. The hunting was good. I have seen the game. Pluck, pluck the gentry, peel them well, bridle them, for the gentry sometimes kick. I congratulate you, Major, that you have caught the young Count. He is a fat morsel, a rich fellow, a young man of old family. Don't let him out of the cage without getting 300 ducats for him. And when you have them, give some 3 pence for my monastery and for me, for I always pray for your soul. As I am a Bernardine, I am very anxious about your soul. Death pulls even staff officers by the ears. Bacca wrote well, that death seizes on sinners at dinners, and on silken frocks she often knocks, and monks' cowls she slashes like satin sashes, and the curb of girls she wraps like shoulder straps. Mother Death, says Bacca, like an onion, brings tears from the deer she embraces, and fondles alike both the baby that drowses and the rake that carouses. Ah, Major, today we live and tomorrow we rot. That only is ours which today we eat and drink. Judge, doesn't it seem to you time for breakfast? I take my seat at the table and beg all to be seated with me. Major, how about some stewed beef and gravy? Lieutenant, what's your idea? Should you like a bowl of good punch? That's a fact, Father, said 2 officers. It's time to be eating and to drink the judge's health. The household, gazing at Roback, marveled whence he had got such a bearing and such jollity. The judge at once repeated the orders to the cook. They brought in a bowl, sugar, bottles, and stewed beef. Plut and Rykov set to work briskly, and so greedily did they feed, and so copiously did they drink, that in a half-hour they had eaten 23 plates of the stewed beef, and emptied an enormous half-bowl of punch. So the Major, full and merry, lolled in his chair, took out his pipe, lighted it with a banknote, and wiping the breakfast from his lips with the end of a napkin, turned his laughing eyes on the women and said, "Fair ladies, I like you as dessert. By my major's epaulettes, when a man has eaten breakfast, the best relish after the stewed beef is chatting with such fair ladies as you, fair ladies. I tell you what, let's have a game of cards, of vingt et un or whist, or shall we start a mazurka? Hey, in the name of 300 devils, why, I am the best dancer of the mazurka in the whole Jager regiment." Thereupon he leaned forward closer to the ladies and puffed out smoke and compliments by turns. "Let's dance!" cried Roback. "When I have finished my bottle, though a monk, I occasionally tuck up my gown and dance a bit of a mazurka. But you see, Major, we are drinking here, and the Jagers are freezing there in the yard. Sport is sport. Judge, give them a keg of brandy. The Major will permit it. Let the bold Jagers have a drink." "I might beg the favor," said the Major, "but you are not forced to grant it." "Judge," whispered Roback, "give 'em a keg of spirits." And thus, while the merry staff tippled in the mansion, outside the house there began a drinking bout among the troops. Captain Rykov drained cup after cup in silence, but the Major drank and at the same time paid court to the ladies, and the ardor for dancing continually increased within him. He threw aside his pipe and seized Telemena's hand. He was eager to dance, but she ran away, so he went up to Zosia, and bowing and tottering invited her to open the mazurka. "Hey, you Rykov, stop pulling at your pipe. Put away your pipe. You play the balalaika well. You see that guitar there? Go, get the guitar and give us a mazurka. I, the Major, will lead out in the first couple." The captain took the guitar and began to tune it. Plut again urged Telemena to dance. "On the word of a Major, madam, I am not a Russian if I lie. May I be the son of a bitch if I lie. Ask, and all the officers will bear witness. All the army will tell you that in the 2nd Army, 9th Corps, 2nd Division of Infantry, 50th Jaeger Regiment, Major Plut is the foremost dancer of the mazurka. Come on, young lady. Don't be so skittish, for I shall punish you in officer's fashion." So saying, he jumped up, seized Telemena's hand, and imprinted a broad kiss on her white shoulder. But Thaddeus, darting in from the side, slapped his face. The kiss and the blow resounded together, one after the other, as word after word. The Major was dumbfounded, rubbed his eyes, and pale with wrath shouted, "Rebellion, a rebel!" and drawing his sword, rushed to run him through. Then the monk took a pistol from his sleeve and cried, "Shoot, Thaddeus, aim for the bull's eye." Thaddeus at once seized it, aimed, and shot. He missed, but he deafened and scorched the Major. Rykov started up with his guitar, crying, "Rebellion, rebellion!" and made for Thaddeus. But from the other side of the table, the seneschal swung his arm with a left-hand motion, and a knife whistled through the air between the heads of the company and struck before they saw it flash. It struck the bottom of the guitar and pierced it through and through. Rykov dodged and thus escaped death, but he was frightened. With a cry of "Jaegers! Rebellion! In God's name!" he drew his sword, and defending himself, he retreated to the threshold. Then on the other side of the room, many of the gentry poured in through the windows with swords, switch at their head. In the hall, Plut and Rykov behind him were calling the soldiers. Already the 3 nearest the house were running to their aid. Already 3 glittering bayonets were gliding through the door, and behind them there were bent forward 3 black helmets. Mickiewicz stood by the door with his switch raised on high, and squeezing close to the wall, lay in wait for them as a cat for rats. Then he struck a fearful blow. Perhaps he would have felled 3 heads, but the old man either had poor eyesight, or else he was too much wrought up, since, before they put forward their necks, he smote on their helmets and stripped them off. The switch, falling, clinked on the bayonets. The Muscovites started back, and Mickiewicz drove them out to the yard. There the confusion was still worse. There the partisans of the Soplicas vied with each other in setting free the Dobzhinskys by tearing apart the beams. Seeing this, the Jaegers seized their arms and made for them. A sergeant rushed ahead and transfixed Podhaisky with a bayonet. He wounded 2 others of the gentry and was shooting at a 3rd. They fled. This was close to the log in which Baptist was fastened. He already had his arms free and ready for fight. He rose, lifted his hand with its long fingers and clenched his fist, and from above he gave the Russian such a blow on the back that he knocked his face and temples into the lock of his carbine. The lock clicked, but the powder, moist with blood, did not catch. The sergeant fell on his arms at the feet of Baptist. Baptist bent down, seized the carbine by the barrel, and brandishing it like his sprinkling brush, lifted it aloft. He whirled it about, and straightway smote 2 privates on the shoulders, and gave a corporal a blow on the head. The rest, terrified, recoiled in dismay from the log. Thus Sprinkler sheltered the gentry with a moving roof. Then they pulled apart the logs and cut the cords. The gentry, once free, descended upon the wagons of the almsgatherer, and from them procured swords, sabres, cutlasses, scythes, and guns. Bucket found 2 blunderbusses and a bag of bullets. He poured some of these into his own blunderbuss. The other gun he loaded in the same way and gave over to Buzzard. More Jaegers arrived, fell into disorder, and knocked against one another. The gentry in the tumult could not cut and slash. The Jaegers could not shoot, for they were fighting hand to hand. Like tooth on tooth, steel on steel clashed and snapped. Bayonet broke on saber and scythe on sword hilt. Fist met fist, and arm met arm. But Rykov, with a part of the Jaegers, ran up to where the barn adjoined the fence. There he made a stand and called to his soldiers that they should stop so disorderly a fight, since, without having a chance to use their weapons, they were falling beneath the fists of the enemy. Angry that he himself could not fire, for in the press he could not distinguish Muscovites from Poles, he shouted, "Fall in," which means form in line, but his command could not be heard in the midst of the shouting. Old Maciek, who was not good at hand-to-hand combat, retreated, clearing a place before him to the right and to the left. Now with the tip of his saber he sheared a bayonet from a gun barrel as a wick from a candle. Now with a slashing blow from the left he cut or stabbed. Thus the cautious Maciek retired to the open field. But an old corporal, who was the instructor of the regiment, a great master of the bayonet, pressed upon him with the utmost obstinacy. He gathered himself together, bent down, and grasped his carbine with both hands, holding the right on the lock and the left at the middle of the barrel. He dodged and skipped, and at times crouched down. He let go with his left hand, and thrust forward the weapon with his right, like the sting from the jaws of a serpent. And again he withdrew it and rested it on his knees. And thus dodging and jumping he pressed upon Maciek. Old Maciek appreciated the skill of his adversary, and with his left hand adjusted his spectacles on his nose. With his right he held the hilt of his close to his breast, and withdrew, following the motions of the corporal with his eyes. He himself tottered on his legs as though he were drunk. The corporal pressed on the more quickly, sure of his triumph, and in order the more easily to reach his retiring foe, he arose and stretched forward his right arm at full length, pushing forward his carbine. He made such an effort in thrusting with his heavy weapon that he even leaned forward. Maciek shoved the hilt of his sword just under the spot where the bayonet is set upon the gun barrel, and knocked up the weapon. Then, suddenly lowering his switch, he wounded the Muscovite in the arm, and again, with a slash from the left, cut through his jaw. Thus fell the corporal, the finest fencer among the Muscovites, a cavalier of 3 crosses and 4 medals. Meanwhile, near the logs, the left wing of the gentry was already near victory. There fought Sprinkler, visible from afar. Their razor hovered around the Muscovites, the latter slashed at their waists, the former pounded their heads. As a machine that German workmen have invented and that is called a thrasher, but is at the same time a chopper, it has chains and knives, and cuts up the straw and thrashes the grain at the same time. So did Sprinkler and razor work together, slaughtering their enemies, one from above and the other from below. But Sprinkler now abandoned sure victory and ran to the right wing, where a new danger was threatening Maciek. Eager to avenge the death of the corporal, an ensign was attacking him with a long spontoon. The spontoon is a combination of pike and axe, now discarded, and employed only in the fleet, but then it was used also in the infantry. The ensign, a young man, ran nimbly back and forth. Whenever his adversary beat the weapon to one side, he retired. Maciek, not being able to drive off the young man, was obliged merely to defend himself without inflicting wounds. Already the ensign had given him a slight wound with the spear. Already, raising the halberd aloft, he was collecting himself for a blow. Baptist was unable to reach him in time, but stopping halfway, he whirled his weapon, and cast it under the feet of his enemy. He broke a bone, and the ensign immediately dropped the spontoon from his hands. He staggered. Baptist rushed on him, and after him a throng of gentry, and after the gentry the Muscovites from the left wing ran up in disorder, and the battle raged around Sprinkler. Baptist, who had lost his arms in defense of Masiek, almost paid for that service with his life, for 2 strong Muscovites fell on him from behind and twisted 4 hands at once into his hair. Bracing their feet, they pulled as on springy cables hitched to the mast of a barge. In vain Sprinkler struck out blindly behind him. He tottered, but suddenly he saw that Gerwazi was fighting close by. He shouted, "Jesus Maria! The penknife!" The warden, hearing Baptist's cry, knew that he was in mortal terror. He turned back and plunged the sharp steel blade between the head of Baptist and the hands of the Muscovites. They withdrew, uttering piercing cries, but one hand, more firmly entwined in the hair, remained hanging and spurted forth blood. Thus an eagle, when it buries one talon in a hare, catches with the other at a tree in order to hold back the beast, but the hare, pulling, splits the eagle in 2. The right talon remains on the tree in the forest. The left, covered with blood, the beast bears away to the fields. Sprinkler, free once more, cast his eyes about, stretched out his hands, sought for a weapon, shouted for a weapon. Meanwhile he brandished his fists, standing his ground manfully, but keeping close to the side of Gerwazi, until he caught sight of his son Buzzard in the press. Buzzard, with his right hand, was aiming a blunderbuss, and with his left was pulling after him a great club, a fathom long, armed with flints and knobs and knots. No one could have lifted it except Baptist. Baptist, when he saw his darling weapon, his sprinkling brush, seized it, kissed it, jumped into the air for joy, whirled it over his head and straightway moistened it. What deeds he then performed, what disasters he spread abroad, it were vain to sing, for none would believe the muse. Even so they did not believe the poor woman in Wilno, who, standing on the summit of the Holy Ostra Gate, saw how Dayov, the Muscovite general, coming on with a regiment of Cossacks, was already opening the gate, and how a single burgher named Charnobaki killed Dayov and routed a whole regiment of Cossacks. Suffice it to say that things came to pass as Rykov had foreseen. The Jaegers in the crowd yielded to the power of their foes. 23 rolled slain on the ground, 30 and more lay groaning with frequent wounds. Many fled and hid in the garden, the hops, or along the river. Some took refuge in the house under the protection of the women. The victorious gentry ran with a cry of joy, some to the casks, others to tear booty from the enemy. Roback alone did not share their exultation. Hitherto he had not fought himself, for the canons forbid a priest to take part in combat. But as an experienced man he had been giving counsel, had run about the battlefield in all directions, and with his glance and his arm had urged on and guided those who were fighting. And now he shouted for them to assemble around him, attack Rykov, and complete the victory. Meanwhile, by a messenger he informed Rykov that if he would lay down his arms, he would preserve his life. But in case the surrender of arms were delayed, Roback gave orders to surround the remnant and cut them down. Captain Rykov was far from asking quarter. Gathering about him half a battalion, he shouted, "Ready!" Immediately the line seized their carbines and the arms rattled. They had long since been loaded. He shouted, "Aim!" and the barrels glittered in a long row. He shouted, "Fire in turn!" and one report followed another. One man shot, another loaded, a third clutched his musket. One could hear the whistling of bullets, the rattle of locks, the clink of ramrods. The whole line seemed to be a moving reptile, which moved 1,000 glittering legs at the same time. To be sure, the Jaegers were drunk with strong liquor. They aimed poorly and missed their mark. Few inflicted wounds, and hardly a single one killed his man. However, 2 of the Mahais were already wounded, and one of the Bartolomews had fallen. The gentry replied but sparingly from their few guns, and were eager to attack the enemy with swords. But the older men restrained them. Each moment the bullets whistled, struck, and forced the gentry to retreat. Soon they would have cleared the yard. Already they began to ring on the windows of the house. Thaddeus, who by his uncle's orders had remained in the house to protect the women, hearing how the battle was becoming ever fiercer and fiercer, ran out, and after him rushed the chamberlain, to whom Thomas had at last brought his saber. He hurriedly joined the gentry and took his place at their head. He ran forward, raising his weapon, and the gentry moved after him. The Jaegers, letting them come near, poured upon them a hail of bullets. Isajuich, Wilbeck, and Razor fell wounded. Then the gentry were checked by Roback on one side and Machi on the other. The gentry cooled in their ardor, glanced about, and retired. The Muscovites saw this, and Captain Rykov planned to give the final blow, to drive the gentry from the yard and seize the mansion. "Form for the attack!" he cried. "Charge bayonets! Forward!" Immediately the line, leveling their gun barrels like poles, bent down their heads, moved on, and quickened their step. In vain the gentry endeavored to check them from in front, and shot from the side. The line passed over half the yard without resistance. The captain, pointing with his sword to the door of the mansion, shouted, "Surrender, judge, or I will order your house to be burned." "Burn it," cried the judge, "and I will roast you in that fire. O mansion of Soplica, if thy white walls are still whole and glitter beneath the lindens, if a throng of the neighboring gentry still sit at the judge's hospitable board, they surely often drink the health of Bucket, for without him Soplica would today be no more." Bucket had so far given few proofs of valor. Though he was the first of the gentry to be freed from the stocks, and though he had straightway found in the wagon his darling Bucket, his favorite blunderbuss, and with it a pouch of bullets, he did not care to fight. He said that he did not trust himself when dry, and so he went to a cask of spirits standing near, and using his hand as a spoon, dipped up a stream into his lips. Only when he had well warmed and strengthened himself did he adjust his cap, take up his bucket from his knees, ram home a charge, sprinkle the pan, and gaze at the battlefield. He saw that a glittering wave of bayonets was smiting and dispersing the gentry, and he swam to meet that wave. He bent down and dived through the dense grass, across the center of the yard, until he paused in ambush where the nettles were growing. With gestures, he summoned Buzzard. Buzzard, who was on guard at the mansion, was standing with his blunderbuss by the threshold, for in that mansion dwelt his dear Zosia, whom he loved eternally, though she had scorned his courtship, and in whose defense he was glad to perish. The line of Jaegers was already entering the nettles on the march, when Bucket touched the trigger, and from the broad mouth of his blunderbuss let fly a dozen chopped bullets into the midst of the Muscovites. Buzzard let fly another dozen, and the Jaegers fell into confusion. Dismayed by the ambuscade, the line folded back into a disorderly mass, retreated, and abandoned the wounded. Baptist finished their slaughter. The barn was already far off. Fearing a long retreat, Rykov made for the garden fence, and there checked his fleeing company in its course. He drew them up, but changed their formation. Instead of a line, he made a triangle, with its point to the front and its base protected by the garden fence. He did well, for the cavalry descended on him from the castle. The Count, who had been in the castle under the guard of the Muscovites, when his terrified guards had dispersed, had mounted his followers, and hearing shots, was leading his cavalry into the firing line, himself at their head, with his steel raised aloft. At once Rykov cried, "Platoon, fire!" A fiery thread flew along over the locks, and from the black leveled barrels 300 bullets whistled. 3 riders fell wounded, and 1 lay dead. The Count's steed fell, and the Count with it. With a cry, the warden ran to the rescue, for he saw that the Jaegers had aimed at the last of the Horeszkos, though in the female line. Roback was nearer, and covered the Count with his body. He received the bullets in his stead, drew him from under his horse, and led him away. But the gentry he bade disperse, take better aim, spare vain shots, and hide behind the fences, the well, and the walls of the stable. The Count and his cavalry had to wait a more fitting season. Thaddeus comprehended Roback's plans, and carried them out splendidly, seeking cover behind the wooden well. And since he was sober and was a fine shot with his fowling piece, for he could hit a gold coin thrown in the air, he did terrible execution on the Muscovites, picking out their chiefs. With his first shot, he at once killed the sergeant major. Then with his 2 barrels, one after the other, he mowed down 2 sergeants, aiming now at the gold lace, now at the middle of the triangle where stood the staff. Thereupon Rykov grew angry and chafed. He stamped his feet and bit the hilt of his sword. "Major Plut," he cried, "what will come of this? Soon not one of us will be left here to give orders. Soplica shouted at Thaddeus in great wrath. Shame on you, you Pole, for hiding behind a plank shelter. Don't be a coward. Come out into the open and fight honorably, as a soldier should. To this Thaddeus replied, Major, if you are so bold a knight, why do you hide behind a company of Jaegers? I am not afraid of you. Come out from behind the fence. You have had your face slapped, but still I am ready to fight with you. Why all this bloodshed? The quarrel was between us two, so let the pistol or the sword settle it. I give you your choice of weapons, from a cannon to a pin. Otherwise, I will shoot you and your men like wolves in a cave. So saying, he shot, and aimed so well that he hit the lieutenant by Rykov's side. Major, whispered Rykov, go out and fight a duel with him, and take vengeance on him for what he did some time ago. If anybody else kills that young gentleman, then, Major, you see that you will not wash off your disgrace. You must coax out that gentleman into the field. If you can't kill him with a carbine, you may with a sword. Old Suvorov used to say, rifles are trifles, but hand arms are grand arms. Go out into the field, Major, for he is shooting at us. Look, he is aiming now. Rykov, my dear friend, replied the Major, you are a fine boy with a sword. Go out yourself, brother Rykov, or, I tell you what, we will send one of our lieutenants. I, the Major, I cannot desert the soldiers. To me belongs the command of the battalion. Rykov, hearing this, lifted his sword and went out boldly. He ordered the firing to cease and waved a white handkerchief. He asked Thaddeus what weapon he preferred. After discussion, they agreed on swords. Thaddeus had no weapon. While they were looking for swords, the Count rushed out armed and interrupted the negotiations. Pan Soplica, he shouted, begging your pardon, you challenged the Major. I have a grudge of longer standing against the captain. He has broken into my castle. Please say our castle, interrupted Prodazi. At the head of a band of robbers, the Count concluded. I recognized Rykov, tied up my jockeys. I will punish him as I punished the brigands beneath the crag that the Sicilians call Berbante Rocca. All became silent and the firing ceased. The armies gazed eagerly at the meeting of their leaders. The Count and Rykov advanced, standing sidewise, threatening each other with the right hand and the right eye. Then with their left hands they uncovered their heads and bowed courteously. It is the custom of men of honor, before proceeding to murder, first to exchange greetings. Their swords were already crossed and had begun to clash. The knights, each lifting one foot, bent their right knees and jumped forward and back by turns. But Plut, seeing Thaddeus in front of his line, had a quiet consultation with Corporal Gaunt, who passed for the best shot in the company. Gaunt, said the Major, you see that rascal there? If you will put a bullet into him right under the 5th rib, I'll give you 4 silver rubles. Gaunt cocked his carbine and bent over the lock. His faithful comrades sheltered him with their cloaks. He aimed, not at the rib, but at the head of Thaddeus. He shot and hit the center of his hat, close to his mark. Thaddeus whirled about. Then Sprinkler rushed on Rykov, and after him the gentry, crying, treason. Though Thaddeus shielded him, Rykov barely managed to retreat and find refuge in the center of his ranks. Again the Dobzhinskis and the other Lithuanians vied with one another in pressing forward, and, despite the former disagreements of the two factions, they fought like brothers, each urging on his comrade. The Dobzhinskis, seeing how a Podhaiski was prancing before the line of Jaegers and slashing them with his scythe, shouted joyfully, "Long live the Podhaiskis! Forward, brother Lithuanians! Hurrah! Hurrah for Lithuania!" And the Skolubas, seeing how the valiant Razor, despite his wound, was dashing on with his saber raised aloft, cried, "Hurrah for the Mickiewicz! Long live the Masovians!" Inspiring one another with courage, they ran upon the Muscovites. In vain Robak and Mickiewicz tried to restrain them. While they were thus smiting the company of Jaegers from the front, the seneschal abandoned the battlefield and went into the garden. By his side strode the cautious Prodazi, to whom the seneschal was quietly issuing orders. In the garden, close to the fence against which Rykov had supported his triangle, stood a large old cheese house, built of lattice-work made of beams nailed across one another, like a cage. In it there shone many scores of white cheeses. Around them bunches of sage, bennet, cardoon, and wild thyme hung drying, the entire herb apothecary shop of the seneschal's daughter. The cheese house was some 20 feet square, but it rested only on a single great pillar, like a stork's nest. The old oaken pillar slanted, for it was already half decayed and threatened to fall. The judge had often been advised to destroy the age-worn structure, but he always said that he preferred to repair it rather than to destroy it, or even to rebuild it. He kept postponing the task to a more convenient season, and in the meantime bade put 2 props under the pillar. The structure, thus strengthened, but still not firm, looked over the fence at Rykov's triangle. Toward this cheese house the seneschal and the apparitor walked silently, each armed with an immense pole, as with a pike. After them the housekeeper stole through the hemp, with the scullion, a small but very strong lad. Arriving at the spot, they rested their poles against the rotted top of the pillar, and, clinging to the ends, pushed with all their might, as when boatmen with long poles push from the bank into the deep water a barge that has grounded on a reef. The pillar snapped, and the cheese house tottered and fell with its load of beams and cheeses on the triangle of Muscovites. It crushed, wounded, and killed. Where the ranks had just now been standing lay beams, corpses, and cheeses, white as snow, stained with blood and brains. The triangle was shattered into bits, and now in the center of it the sprinkling brush thundered, the razor flashed, and the switch slashed. From the mansion rushed a throng of gentry, and the count from the yard gate sent his cavalry against the scattered fugitives. Now, only 8 Jaegers, with a sergeant at their head, still defended themselves. The warden ran against them, but they boldly stood their ground and aimed 9 musket barrels straight at the brow of the warden. He flew to meet the shot, brandishing the blade of his penknife. The monk saw it and ran across Gerwazi's path. He fell and tripped Gerwazi. They fell at the very moment when the platoon fired. Hardly had the bullets whistled over him when Gerwazi rose and jumped up into the smoke. He straightway sheared off the heads of 2 Yagers. The rest fled in confusion. The warden chased and slashed them. They ran across the yard, Gerwazi on their track. They rushed into the door of a shed standing open, and Gerwazi entered the shed at their heels. He vanished in the darkness, but did not quit fighting, for through the door could be heard groans, yells, and frequent blows. Soon all became silent. Gerwazi came out alone, with a bloody sword. Now the gentry had won the field. They pursued, slashed, and stabbed the dispersed Jaegers. Rykov alone remained, and cried that he would not lay down his arms. He was still fighting when the chamberlain went up to him, and, raising his saber, said in an impressive tone, "Captain, you will not soil your honor by accepting quarter. Unhappy, but valiant knight, you have given ample proof of your daring. Now abandon hopeless resistance. Lay down your arms before we disarm you with our sabers. You will preserve life and honor. You are my prisoner." Rykov, overcome by the dignity of the chamberlain, complied, and gave over to him his naked sword, bloody to the hilt, saying, "Brother Poles, woe is me that I did not have even a single cannon." Suvorov said, "Well, remember, comrade Rykov, never to attack the Poles without cannon." "Well, the Jaegers were drunk. The major let them drink. Ah, Major Plut, he has played sad tricks today. He will answer for them to the Tsar, for he was in command. I will be your friend, Chamberlain. There is a Russian proverb, Chamberlain, who loves well, shoves well. You are good at a bottle and good at a battle, but stop playing your rough jokes on my Jaegers." Hearing this, the Chamberlain raised his saber and, through the apparitor, proclaimed a general pardon. He gave orders to tend the wounded, to clear the field of troops, and to disarm and imprison the Jaegers. They searched long for Plut. He had buried himself deep in a nettle bush and lay there as if dead. At last he came out when he saw that the battle was over. Thus ended the last foray in Lithuania.
Remember to subscribe.